The most important business meeting of the year was supposed to end with a handshake, a signed agreement and a $200 million investment, but instead it began with one small act of disrespect that would eventually bring an entire company to its knees. Michael Carter, a 39-year-old single father, walked into the executive conference room carrying a black leather briefcase and a folder containing the final documents for his $200 million funding commitment. He had built his investment company carefully over many years while raising his 8-year-old son Noah on his own. Michael was not the loudest or most fashionable man in the room, but he had earned a reputation for being disciplined, honest, and extremely careful with his money. Across the polished conference table sat Victoria Reed, the 48-year-old CEO of Sterling Horizon Corporation. She was powerful, wealthy, and known throughout the business world for making people wait for her attention. When Michael approached her before the meeting and respectfully extended his hand, Victoria looked at him from head to toe. His dark suit was simple, his shoes were modest, and his old leather briefcase showed years of use. Instead of accepting his hand, Victoria slowly pulled hers back and turned toward the executives beside her. The room immediately became uncomfortable. Michael stood there, for a moment with his hand still extended before quietly lowering it. Victoria then introduced him as the single father who was providing the funding for their expansion, making the enormous investment sound like a favor she was allowing him to make. Michael said nothing. He took his seat and listened as Victoria proudly described how the company would use his $200 million to open new facilities, expand into several states, and acquire smaller competitors. Everyone in the room assumed Michael would sign because the agreement had already been negotiated. But Michael was no longer listening to the numbers. He was thinking about the moment she refused to shake his hand. He remembered something his late father had taught him. Money can be replaced, but dignity cannot. When the final contract was placed in front of him, Michael closed the folder instead of signing it. Victoria asked what he was doing. Michael calmly told her that the funding would not be transferred. Her expression changed instantly. She assumed he was bluffing, but Michael stood, collected his documents, and explained that he could never place $200 million into the hands of someone who could not offer him basic respect. He walked out without raising his voice. Victoria watched him leave, completely unaware that the handshake she had refused had just cost her company its future. The following morning, Sterling Horizon Corporation began experiencing the consequences of Michael's decision. The finance department confirmed that the $200 million funding commitment had been formally withdrawn. Victoria initially refused to believe that the situation could become serious. She ordered her executives to contact other investors, convinced that a company of Sterling Horizon's size would easily replace one investor, but the reality was very different. The entire expansion program had been designed around Michael's funding. Construction agreements had already been signed. New facilities were under development. Equipment had been ordered, and hundreds of employees had been hired in anticipation of the expansion. Without the $200 million, the company suddenly had enormous financial obligations, with no money available to cover them. Within days, banks began demanding new guarantees. Contractors stopped work on several projects. Suppliers demanded immediate payment. The board called an emergency meeting and asked Victoria why the funding had disappeared. She finally admitted that Michael had withdrawn after their meeting, but she avoided explaining the personal reason behind his decision. Meanwhile, rumors spread throughout the company. Employees feared layoffs, managers worried about their departments, and investors began questioning whether Victoria was capable of leading the corporation. Michael returned to his own company and continued working while taking care of Noah. He did not celebrate Sterling Horizon's problems. He had never intended to destroy anyone's livelihood. He simply refused to ignore what had happened. Victoria eventually called him herself. Michael answered, but when she asked him to restore the funding, he calmly told her that the problem was never really the money. The problem was that she had treated him as though his position as a single father made him less worthy of respect. Victoria argued that she had been under pressure and that the handshake had meant nothing. Michael replied, "That small moments reveal how People behave when they believe nobody important is watching. That sentence stayed with Victoria. The financial situation became worse. The company began selling assets to raise cash, canceled expansion contracts, and announced major cost reductions. Employees who had believed the company was entering its strongest period suddenly found themselves facing uncertainty. The board eventually informed Victoria that unless a solution was found, Sterling Horizon could collapse within weeks. For the first time in her career, Victoria realized that her own arrogance had helped create the crisis. She had thought Michael needed her company more than her company needed him. She had been completely wrong. Weeks later, Sterling Horizon was close to collapse. Victoria had lost the confidence of several investors, and the board was preparing to remove her from leadership. Instead of trying to blame Michael, she finally accepted responsibility for what had happened. She returned to the same conference room where she had refused his arm handshake and sat alone at the table. She remembered how Michael had stood there, with his hand extended while she had deliberately turned away. For the first time, she understood that the moment had revealed something much deeper than a simple business disagreement. She had judged a man because he was a single father, because he did not dress like the executive she was accustomed to, and because she assumed money gave her the right to decide who deserved respect. Victoria contacted Michael again and asked for one final meeting. This time, when Michael entered the room, Victoria did not remain seated. She stood immediately. She apologized without excuses and admitted that she had allowed her position to make her forget the value of ordinary human respect. She told him that the company was collapsing, but she did not ask him to rescue her. Instead, she asked whether he would consider giving the company one final chance to prove that it could change. Michael listened carefully. He explained that he had withdrawn the $200 million to protect his dignity, not to punish thousands of employees who depended on their jobs. He agreed to consider returning the investment, but only after the company accepted strict financial oversight, changed its leadership policies, and demonstrated that employees and business partners would be treated with respect regardless of their wealth or status. Victoria agreed to every condition. The funding eventually returned in carefully controlled stages, allowing Sterling Horizon to avoid complete collapse and rebuild its operations. Months later, the company became stable again, but Victoria never forgot the lesson. One afternoon, Michael returned to the same office. Victoria walked toward him and extended her hand. This time she did not hesitate. Michael looked at her for a moment before accepting it. The handshake she had once refused now carried far more meaning than any contract. It represented humility, accountability, and a second chance that had been earned rather than demanded. Michael later went home to Noah and told him that standing up for yourself does not always mean fighting. Sometimes it means quietly walking away from something valuable when the price is your dignity. And Victoria learned that a company can recover from losing $200 million, but leadership can only survive when respect comes before money. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to Kindness with Smile. Before you leave, comment respect comes first if you believe every person deserves dignity, whether they are rich, poor, a CEO, or a single parent. Sometimes a handshake lasts only 2 seconds, but the way we choose to give or refuse it can reveal everything about who we really are. The end.